if you wouldn't mind. Thank you so much for hitting that record button, Shay. All right, good afternoon and welcome in, everyone. My name is Daniela Labate Covelli. I'm from NIAPERS. I'm the Director of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Training here. Happy to see all of you joining today for our presentation on sharing power, developing non-hierarchical working relationships. So Shay is with us in the background, as is Eileen from our office. So just a quick shout out to them. Thank you for your help in the background. If you wouldn't mind just advancing that slide for me and I can get through the housekeeping and then we'll go ahead and get started. So we do have our partner slide that I wanted to share with you. I think you're all aware of our partners. So today's webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to find the slides as well as the recording on our website, psychrehabacademy.org, in the archived training page. We are offering 1.5 continuing education units for LMSWs, LCSWs, CPRPs, LMHCs, KSACs, LCATs, and MFTs. These are the only credentials or licenses that we were able to get continuing education units for this training event. In order to qualify for those continuing education credits, we'll ask that you complete the evaluation form and indicate which continuing ed credit you are seeking and return it back to us. We also want folks who are not asking for continuing education credits to complete that evaluation. And that's so that we can keep track of your training hours to accrue CPRP time. We'll see that today's
interesting, good feedback. Another reason to fill out that evaluation page.
That's right. Let all our presenters, we always want to hear from you, actually. That's a very good point.
Right.
But it's also important for you to keep track of your hours. You'll see we're in a different setting today. We're usually in the webinar setting, but today we're using meetings. And that's because we're going to be asking you to do some breakout sessions. We're going to have a breakout session. We're also going to be using some live polling. So get your cell phones out if they are not, because we're going to be asking you to do some live polling throughout. Because we have so many people on the Zoom meeting platform today, though, we do ask that you please keep yourself muted. You can, however, feel free to turn on your cameras. We're happy to see you, but because there are so many people on, we want to be able to reduce the background noise a little bit. So we're asking that you keep yourself muted unless you raise your hand and we unmute you and you can speak, because we will be doing a little bit of that as well. We do have time at the end for questions, and we hope you'll use the chat box to chat your questions in and to communicate with us. We'll be keeping track of that. And as always, the information you receive is accurate as of today's date, which is Wednesday, April 12th, 2023. That's my little disclaimer there. So on the next slide, we're just going to introduce you to our presenters. So yeah, I was just asking about muting people. There you go. If you do not mute yourself, I just want to warn you, we will mute you for you. All right. So a little bit about our presenters today. Rita Cronice is distance faculty with Rutgers University's Academy of Peer Services. She's also the co-director of PeerTech, and she's a certified advanced level RAP facilitator. She's a peer specialist and a peer specialist trainer in the VA. And she's also led the development of an advanced peer specialist training for the SAMHSA funded recovery practice program. We are so happy that Rita is a consultant with us on this project. She's a friend of NIAPER, certainly, and we're really excited to have her with us. And then we also have her partner in crime for this Zoom meeting, at least, and that's Lynn Legere. Lynn is a person in long-term recovery herself from substance use and mental health challenges, who actually came to the Center for Psychiatric Rehabilitation as a volunteer in the early days of her recovery, and it looks like they couldn't get rid of her. Right. She served as the director of the Peer Support Training and Certification Program at the Transformation Center in Massachusetts, and later at the Promise Resource Network in Charlotte, North Carolina. She's currently part of the Boston University Center for Psych Rehab team and is one of our consultants on this project. I want to just publicly thank both of you for your participation in the training curriculum so far and for this effort. We literally couldn't do it without our consultants. So thank you both for your work on this project and for this web meeting. So with that, I'm going to be quiet for a little while, imagine that, and turn it over to Lynn to start us off.
Hi, everybody. Hello. As she said, my name's Lynn. That's the hardest part. Who am I? And it's really nice to be here with y'all today. As she mentioned, my recovery was started at the Psych Rehab Center at BU, so it's something I feel a lot of affinity about. And so to get us started off, I wanted to sort of give a definition of psych rehab because all of this project in the big picture is around psych rehab. Today, we'll be talking about that intimate one-to-one relationship within psych rehab, but it's all within sort of this larger picture. So one of the definitions that I really like is that psych rehab promotes recovery, full community integration, and improved quality of life for persons who have been diagnosed with any mental health condition that seriously impairs their ability to lead meaningful lives. Psych rehab services are collaborative, person-directed, and individualized. What I thought was important about really bringing this definition to the beginning of our conversation today is when we look back sort of in the history of psych rehab, when it first came out some 40 plus years ago with a definition like this, it was shocking to the world. We're talking about a time when the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was in theaters and not that far off from the way services were offered. I know I was in one of those institutions at the time, and believe me, that movie's not that far off. So to have somebody like Bill Anthony come out in those years and say, psych rehab says that individuals on their own with some support from us are the ones who choose, get, and keep their goal in their living, learning, working, or social environment was considered basically blasphemy. It was so against the grain of the belief system at the time. And Bill literally had tomatoes and other things thrown at him on the stage when he would talk in the early days. I'm really glad that now we are 40 plus years later and the world has changed a lot, thankfully. We really, if we look back to those days, we see how far we've come. But today, of course, we're going to talk about those places where we're still trying to grow, because not only do we want to see where we've come, we want to keep moving forward. That march continues on. And so we'll be talking about how we actually bring this especially collaborative, person-directed, and individualized onto the ground through minimizing our power differentials and having non-hierarchical relationships, which are very challenging. Am I in charge of the slides? I hate to ask, but it's no. Thank you for letting me know that. So to get us going, I want to ask a question, and I want you all to either use the Q code and you can go into that, or you can join at slido.com and use that code number. The question is, in a word or two, what does the word power mean to you? Just take a minute and think about that power. Just a word or two, what does it mean to you? Control. Yeah, that's a good starter word. Ooh, we have a lot of endorsers for that one. Authority, responsibility, that yes. Having authority over or strength to leverage, yes. Oh, these are such great words. Unequal, and yet leadership, right? Or authoritarian on one side, confident on the other, right? Such an interesting word, power. Keep putting in your one or two words.
We've also got some stuff coming in through the chat box. We have another authority. We have having control, empowerment, access, large, ability to help, leadership, decision-making, oppression.
Wow. How interesting. We have empowerment and we have oppression. All correct, right? This word power has so many levels to it, so many dynamics. Influential is coming in the chat box now. That ability to do, maybe from a place of advantage, right? Or the ability to create change. So we're seeing this one word power has so many different meanings across a very wide range, from very positive to very negative, right? And so that brings us to today about how do we think about this word? How do we think about how we use or consider power in our services? And how do we make it so that neither one in a relationship can be in this place of dangerous, another word, right? Being dangerous to someone else, or authoritarian or counterproductive, having authority over, but instead bringing in some of those other attributes, which is about choice and about responsibility, right? About decision making. So in a much more neutral, shared way. Okay, we still have one more person typing. Nice. These are great. Thank you all. And it does not surprise me that in the middle, in bold, what do we see? Control. That's what we the most associate this thing of power with, is control. Power and control are often put in together. So let's start, and chat is still going on with some other great terms. Let's start with what let me give you a keyword though, which is yellow, for those of you who, do we need to explain? Thank you. Okay, good. All right.
You know, sorry, Lynn, actually, you're right. I forgot to mention that at the beginning in the housekeeping, so I apologize. Let's just pause for a second and talk about these keywords. I think you all know what the keywords we're up to with these keywords by now. This is our third offering. But for those of you that are new to keywords, this is our way to make sure that you stay for the entire session, especially for those folks that are watching the recording. And there is a section in the evaluation where we'll ask you for the keywords. So please take note of the keywords. You can write them down on a pad on your desk, but you'll need them for the evaluation. Okay, so the first keyword, as Lynn mentioned, is here on your screen, and it is yellow.
Yellow baby. Yellow submarine is our first keyword that is bringing us to, next slide, please, the actual definition of power. And I love word etymology. I like to go back and see all the roots. So I did that with the word power, and it's an old word out of Anglo-Norman French language of, I don't know, the 1400s or the 900s or something like that. But that really meant initially, and still in many ways, the same meaning of strength of either the body or the mind or the collective. And I think right there, that talks about all the different kinds of answers we got in the box, right? But then much more commonly, authority over self or others, or influence. So the way I really like to think of it, rather than sort of a definition, is that really power is, as a noun, to be technical, but it's something that we have, right? There's that inherent power that we either have as people, or that we have by title, or by sort of our place in life, but it's also something we do. Power is something that, in especially its most either destructive or promoting way, is action. It comes out of action. So power is often action and things that we do. So next slide, please. And so again, going back to all the words that you guys put in the box, power can be used in very unequal ways, right? Power itself is an ever-changing concept, and it really depends on how it's used, that what its definition is. It can be exercised in ways that are really helpful, and a lot of places that you guys identified in there were really helpful, like power to create change or useful change. but it can also be used in unhelpful ways. And more importantly, I think, especially for our conversation today, is it can be used in ways that are actually harmful, right? When I think of sort of even in one-on-one relationships as a supervisor, right? I can exercise my power in that role as supervisor to guide and inspire people to do their best work and to feel accomplished in the work that they do. I can also use that power as a supervisor to squelch all creativity and make it clear that as a supervisor, you do it my way or the highway, right? So it's how I use that power in that role that ultimately makes the difference of how that ends up being expressed in our work. And that's what we want to really be thinking about, is what power do we have by a whole bunch of different ways? And then what do we do with the many kinds of power we may have been invested with?
And I wanted to just shout out in the chat, Anthony said, with much power comes much responsibility.
Indeed, it does. I would say that that's probably one of the best things today, because that is true. The more power we have, the more responsibility we have to be aware of it, to know how it can be used across the spectrum, and to make sure that we're using it in the most positive ways and not in the negative, harmful ways. So thank you for that, Anthony. Next slide, please. So we've got another little Slido for you guys, all about power again. And this one's a little trickier, but think about a situation in which you had no power, because we've all been in those situations, right? In a word or two, how did this make you feel? Small, helpless, yeah. Trapped, afraid. Oh, defeated, yeah. Angry. Oh, insecure, yes. Insignificant, anxious. Stuck. Oh, these are great words for the question. They're all such painful words, right? All of these places are such painful places. Pointless. Yeah. Broken. Ooh, muted. Yeah. And not in Zoom. Muted in a much larger scale. Vulnerable. Hurt. Yep. Oh, defective. Oh man. Again, these are all so on target, and they hurt, right? Can't breathe, at the mercy of others. COVID lockdown and frustrated. Yeah. Oh, it's a terrible place, isn't it? I just look at this slide and I sort of like slump in my chair. It just, the weight of just looking at the words, voiceless. It's not invisible. These aren't places that we want to be, right? And it's certainly not a place we want to make anyone else feel like they are. And that's why today's discussion is so important. How do we make sure in our work that intentionally or not intentionally, right? Implicitly or not, that we're not leading other people that we're supposed to be supporting to go into the place of feeling any of these, because they're horrible and we really don't want to be in that place. Oh my God, it's just so painful. And that's why we're doing today, because we're going to be talking about some actual steps that we can take to make sure that we don't go into this place. And one of the first places to sort of think about, how do we make sure we're not doing things or acting in ways that leave other people feeling like they have no power, or not acknowledging that they have had no power, and reinforcing that, right? That one of the first things that we want to think about is, are we doing our work in a trauma-informed way? And that's our next slide. Oh, well, I jumped a slide, so let's go to the next slide and we'll come back to this because they all go together. No, I'm sorry, the other direction. One more. Thank you. Sorry about that. That was I went too far. So one of the ways is to make sure that our work is coming from this place of trauma informed, which is very in alignment with psych rehab, even though they sort of came from different threads. The values are totally overlapping and totally in alignment because we want all of our services to be trauma informed. So number one, and these are, I hope, and I expect very familiar to you. So just for a quick review, we want to make sure that all of our work is done from a place of safety. And that's not just physical safety, although that matters, right? We don't want to be meeting people in places where even the environment doesn't feel safe, but also emotional safety, obviously, right? Also, and this is so easy to step away with without realizing it, but trustworthiness and transparency, that if we say we're going to do something, we do it. We do what we say and we say what we do, and that we're open about things and treat people like adults who can handle just a regular, honest, transparent conversation. Bringing peer support in so people can have the hope that life can indeed get better. That's what changed my life when I walked into the BU Center 24 years ago and found out that people actually do recover from mental health conditions, and that people can go and work again and live life. I didn't know that. And that changed my life, just seeing that. And so having peer support where people can see the evidence that things get better and hear from the experts who have walked it about some of the ways to get from here to there, right? Collaboration and mutuality. I'm not even going to touch this one right now because the whole rest of our presentation is going to be on that. But empowerment, voice, and choice, and cultural, historical, all those bottom three, we're spending the rest of the time talking about. So I am going to go back one more slide and get a little more concrete of some basic things that help us begin to get in this place or enrich the place that we've already been getting to, but getting there in even greater enrichment is first and foremost seeing the person and not the disability, right? That every single one of the people we work with is an entire person that we're only seeing a crumb of. We're seeing them in their distress, or we're seeing them in their need. And it's so easy to forget there's an entire lifetime of experience and personhood that we may not be privy to see, but that the person is a full person, and not just that disability and struggle that they're bringing. Developing a trusting partnership, which says together we're going to work, and I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to be trustful for you. Supporting the person to figure out what they want, right? We often think about, well, what do you want to do? And people more often than not say, I don't know. And that's often because of learned helplessness or having been so defeated that it's really hard to hope enough to say, this is what I'd like. So really helping people move to that place where they can risk to say, well, really what I want to do is be a teacher, not really just work at McDonald's, right? Those things take risks, and people can only take those risks if we're trustworthy and they feel like they can do that for us. And then to support the person and really developing out the plan. You know, this to me is one of the greatest gifts of psych rehab, is that we say, you know, do the dream-centered planning, help people tap into the dream, but then help them make the plan to the dream. Because a dream without a plan is just, you know, a hope or an aspiration, but the plan is what really makes it work and doable and feasible. So helping people with all those parts of it. So these are just some of the small first steps that we may want to take to begin to share that power more. And for many of us, that may not have been the way we were trained. We were trained to see ourselves as the expert. And it's hard to step away and really see the person as the expert. But that's really the step that we're taking more and more. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Rita. To the next slide. Oh, no, I'm not. We're going to review the definition again. As practitioners, we support people to find and use their power in the process. And we're going to do a breakout room. All right, so Shay, I know you're getting the breakout rooms ready. And this is what we want you guys to do in your breakout. So we're gonna have about 3 or 4 of you in each breakout room. And, we talked about some sort of theoretical stuff and great stuff this morning. But the reality is when we get on the ground, it's a lot harder. It's great to say, help the person get here or meet the person where they're at. But we have so many things that get in the way on the ground. So what are some of the barriers that really make this idea of nice, equal, collaborative partnerships happen? What gets in the way, right? And so we're gonna send you into rooms and just together sort of come up with some ideas. If anybody in the room has some paper, you may wanna scribe down what some of your ideas are, because when we come back, we're gonna ask you to share some of those.
And just for some logistics, we're going to take about 15 minutes in the breakout room. So you'll have ample time to have this conversation. And as Lynn said, jot down a few of your ideas. And we're going to, in the large room, we're going to continue having this conversation as well. So as we go into the breakout rooms, if you find that you can't get into a breakout room, we're still going to continue the exercise here in the big room too.
Come on back and we'll chat with you.
So whenever you're ready.
Yep. Okay. There we go. You should receive an invitation to the chat room on your computer. I mean, to the breakout room, sorry. So Rita.
Yeah.
What are some of the barriers that you've seen?
That get in the way of a collaborative, equalizing relationship? I think fear. I think often people are afraid.
Yeah.
Especially especially if they've been not treated as equals before, they're afraid that they don't know, that they don't know anything, that the expert really is the person who knows everything.
Yep.
I think that's one thing that gets in the way.
Absolutely, I agree. And, I think that, one of the greatest gifts that we can do for people is to support them to be self-determining. But for some people, that means learning the skills of being self-determining. And that's one of the things we may have to do is really support the person to find their voice and let them know it's okay to share by, asking some good questions and giving more room and more space for the answer instead of just moving on really quickly, And so I think time is one of the barriers that gets in the way. I think it takes time. And I think people feel so hurried and rushed and overstretched already. And that, setting a goal or writing a plan or any of this is sort of something they have to check off within 30 days. So we got to go, we got to go, we got to go. And it's really hard to sit down and invite someone into, oops, am I up? Oh no, you're still here. Invite someone into the conversation in a relaxed way to give the person time and space when you don't feel like you have the time and space to give.
Mm. I think having that sense of comfort and safety too. I think it takes time to build that trust. So like you said, it takes a lot of time sometimes to reach a point where we can have these equal kinds of non-hierarchical relationships.
Yeah. I think it's also hard. I know for me, at a certain point, every provider was a provider. Sort of the relationship of the present was colored by the relationships of the past. And I think that's where peer support can make such a difference because it feels different, right? It's not even how much it is different, it's how much different it feels because we have that shared experience. Like, oh my God, you've been through this too. okay, you're a real person who understands what I'm talking about, right? Doesn't matter if that's accurate or not. That's the feeling that people often get, and that opens the door to greater vulnerability and greater comfort in being able to share. I
Well,
was in breakout
there's also,
roommate.
there's
Yeah, I
also
was
the belief, you know, believing that you can get better. If you've been in a system that's told you all the time that you're never going to get better, and then all of a sudden you encounter somebody who did, and it's like, oh, well,
that's
maybe
right.
I can do that too.
Makes such a difference. Like, oh my God, if she can maybe, even if it only gets to maybe I can get better too. You know, that's for many of us, that was a big leap, just getting to the maybe. Yep.
I wonder if culture has something to do with it too, because so often, you know, in different cultures, that hierarchy is just a given. It's invisible.
Yep.
It becomes
Yep.
just given. And recognizing
Absolutely.
that there's, yep.
And the relationship to experts, you know, people that have doctor or letters after their names, culturally, there's just much more reverence given than to the white culture at this point in time. You know, I think there was a time that we were as much also as as reverent, but I think we also tend to be more of a independent me kind of a culture rather than a more family or connected that sort of has these different roles more implanted. And I know that for the Latino community, the minute somebody is a doctor or somebody, they're the ones who know, and I'm going to only look to them for the answer, right? And that needs to be, people need to be mindful of that while they're supporting people, right?
Yeah, that hierarchy even exists within the hierarchy. I mean, if you really think about it, there's the doctors, then there's the nurses, and then there's the social workers, and then there, you know, and it just keeps going on and on. And everybody has to report to somebody.
Yep.
But why can't those be equal relationships too? I mean, they could,
Right.
but they just
Right.
aren't the way that things are set up right now.
And isn't that maybe the biggest barrier, is that we're not acculturated within any of our cultures to be in that equal place. You know, we're raised with hierarchy. We're structured to be in hierarchy. Everybody has a boss, you know, even the boss has a boss. So that's just sort of, you know, it's the way we've functioned and been taught to function for a long time. So in a way, it's almost an unnatural thing that we're asking people to do. Not unnatural, but unusual.
And
Not something we're not accustomed to.
yeah, as you're talking about the boss and the boss, you know, we're doing a lot of work with supervision right now to try to equalize that supervisory relationship, particularly with peers, where, you know, the peers actually know more than the supervisors about what peers do. So there needs to be kind of a realignment of who knows what and how it gets done. But there's still always that reporting structure too. So there's all kinds of different ways in which power plays out and hierarchies
Yep.
happen.
Yep. And hierarchy isn't necessarily bad. It's not inherently bad. It depends on the situation that you're in. I used to, when I did the, we have 3 unassigned people I'm getting a message of. I just want to make sure that that doesn't mean, oh, we're 2 of them. Okay. Sorry, I just was getting a message on that. I didn't want to think people were hanging in cyberspace. When I was doing the training and certification in Massachusetts, there was a time when it was really helpful that everybody had their opinion. And then I came in and said, okay, so I've heard all your opinions and I'm going to make the decision. And here's the way we're going to go for now. And we may change it later. You needed that, you know, otherwise you would never have gotten to the next class, right? So there are times when leadership or collaborative leadership, there is times when having, you know, sort of somebody who is going to take ultimate responsibility and say it's on me and I'll take the responsibility and I will take all the input and we'll try this for now. And we can keep talking about it, but we're going to make a decision now. And here's what it is, you know, it can be done in a way that's useful.
So Daniela, okay.
Yeah, I've sort of lost track of time, but are they
Well, we were going to give them 15. We were going to give them 15 minutes. I was going to say come back in 5 minutes, but I think we could probably bring them back in 2.
okay? Yeah, I can't. Oh, I can do you want me to announce that? Oh, they've already been closed. They're on their way back.
Oh, they are? Okay.
Yeah, they've just been told they have 58 seconds to abandon their place and come back to the main room.
Well, I think that worked well. So, you know, some of the things that you and I talked about were fear, or, you know, the power dynamic of the hierarchy.
Time,
safety, feeling
Yep.
safe, developing trust.
having the skills to do it.
Yep. So are they back?
No, I think
We're coming
highlighting.
back. Yep.
Okay.
Oh, good.
Welcome back, everyone.
Guys.
So the way we had envisioned this, and if you could go to the next slide, please. The way we had envisioned this was to just open it up for comment, you know, based on your discussions, what are the barriers that get in the way of a collaborative, equalizing relationship? And you can use the chat, or you can raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can share a little bit about the discussion that was in your group. And I think Steve Notniak, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah. For our group, we had a really good conversation. Some of the stuff that was talked about was like the fact that there's billing, and for billing you need to have justification, and the system does justification based on demonstrated need, and demonstrated need is based on there being a problem. And so the way the structure of funding and all that kind of stuff works causes a slant in the challenge of minimizing the power differential. And one of the other things that was talked about, though, is just that realization, like when someone has someone has a PhD, or they have a doctor after, in front of their name, and then you go call them Dr. so and so, and they say, just call me Steve. They're like, that I think is a good demonstration of what happens when someone who has power sets it down and then just allows it to minimize it, and just that feeling that can offer. So that's what we had our discussion around. It was pretty good.
Great.
That was great.
Yeah.
And so let me respond now just to some from the chat. Also, and there are several themes that came up that I think are that Rita and I also had as we were talking about it. Cultural differences and language barriers, huge ones, especially in terms of different cultural relationships to experts or doctors or whatever. I think that changes across different cultures of what those titles mean, and how we respond and relate to those makes a big difference. Lack of staffing, which leads to limited time. Another thing that Rita and I had discussed also, that it takes time to be collaborative. It takes time to invite people in and make the space for people to feel comfortable to be in that space with us. And when we don't have time, Go ahead.
So I want to get to some of the people that have their hands raised. Anthony, go ahead.
Okay, I found the mute button. So one thing I wanted to mention in relationship to the billable question and the goal thing is that you can have for a goal that person will maintain stability. Because sometimes when somebody's moving slower than we would want them to, and they're just figuring it out, or they're scared to death, for us to be engaged is better than not to, because if we're not engaged, we're often one of the main things helping them be stable. and not going to the hospital. So I'll just put that out there, that that's a useful way to put that. So we're not in that bind, because if we do put ourselves in that bind, some people are gonna fall through the cracks, and we know that.
Yeah. So sometimes creative documentation, right? Seeing what we're doing in the lens of what they're looking for can sometimes help a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have Laura. Laura has her hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. The first thing that comes to my mind is the fact that most of us work in paid positions. So that immediately kind of sets off the relationship as being, not equal. So that's something I'm always trying to counteract. The other thing that came to mind was the nomenclature, how we refer to people, with them, amongst ourselves, that has a tremendous impact. So the words we use are very important.
And I also would add in behind closed doors, which always gets out. Yep. And I wanted to add in just a couple more from the chat. Learned helplessness and that lack of support or lack of resources, all of those lacks that bear down on the sort of basic needs, right? When we need food, housing, and clothing, it's hard to have a collaborative relationship about higher level things, because we're really caring about getting food, clothing, and shelter, some of the basics, right? So that's certainly gonna get in the way. And then another one that I so agreed with is one person is saying lack of boundaries on both sides, hopelessness and helplessness on both sides, right? And we know that too many of us may come into the work for some of the wrong reasons and bring our own trauma into the work, and so that we have a whole bunch of trauma bouncing off of trauma on both sides, right? From both the side of provider and people using services, and that can get really messy and resentful in the process.
Yeah. And I was thinking about the clinician's illusion, which is, where people see people at their worst all the time, and they only see people at their worst, and they never see people get better. So they always believe that people are always going to be at their worst. That becomes kind of an illusion. It was a study that was in the 80s. And they found that the researchers saw much better progress, in the actual research than the clinicians saw. And it was because the clinicians just didn't think people could get better, and so they didn't. And so that's one of the areas where we come in, as people that have had an experience of recovery, and it changes that whole dynamic, because then the clinicians have a chance to see people who really have gotten better. And often I remember that once upon a time I had a friend who told me it's really important once we leave the hospital to go back and thank the people that helped us while we were there, because they don't otherwise see or know what they've done to help people. So I think that's a really true thing.
Excellent.
So are we good with the chat? I know there's a lot in the chat. We could go on for
so much. And I hope you all have had a chance to scan through the chat as well. There's so many great, like family, right? Family role, family trauma that gets in the way. Too much having to work with other agencies as well. And we may try to be collaborative, but we're also, other agencies are coming in there too. And there's a lot of players that can certainly erode any efforts at collaborative relationships. Parole, right? If we've got anything that has to do with forensic work, it just adds 47 layers of authoritarianism onto our attempts at collaborative relationships, right? So yeah, lots of challenges, which makes our work all the more important, I would say. Yeah.
And so we're all going to walk out of here being able to address all those barriers, right? At least
Ready
we
to
can start
go.
working towards them. So I go ahead and move ahead. And so if we could get the next slide, we've got our keyword. Our next keyword is orange. So the keyword orange is our next one. I'll pause for a moment and let that, just make sure everybody has seen that. And then we'll go on to the next slide, where we talk a little bit about what does it mean to share power with diverse populations. So I'm going to take us back to the last webinar, which was working with diverse populations with Marie and Lenora. And we learned from that particular session about the data about disparities across the social determinants of health for marginalized populations, that racism and other discriminatory practices have caused people with certain cultural attributes or identities to either unfairly receive access in the case of people who have privilege, or to be denied access in the case of people who have been disadvantaged to the power and control that's so fundamental in their own lives. So the question is, what does it mean to share power with those who have lived without power for a very long time? So when we meet people where they are, our next task is to start looking at how we can provide equitable treatment. And I know you all have probably seen some slides that are very similar to this. I really like this. Lenora actually shared it with me to share with you. And it's the difference between inequality, where there's unequal access to things. There's equality, where you're giving people of different populations the same, but sometimes what happens, as you see with the ladders on the lower left, one ladder is not even reaching the trees and the other one is able to reach, but that's equally, given equal treatment. Equity is where you actually give the person who needs a little bit extra help a little extra boost. So that's the extra ladder that reaches a little bit further up. But beyond that, when you look at the tree bending over, that's kind of like the whole system is bending away from people who really have not traditionally had power. So in order to really create justice, you're really you're shoring up the tree so that it's straight again and everybody has equal access to it. So that's just a kind of illustration of when we meet people where we're at, our next task is to provide equitable treatment. And while the terms equity and equality may sound similar, you can see by the illustration that the implementation of one can lead to dramatically different outcomes, especially for the marginalized populations. And I just had a definition here that I wanted to share. This is from the Health and Human Services. They have some really good infographics. And this one is, what is equitable treatment? It's the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including individuals who belong to underserved communities that have been denied such treatment, such as Black, Latino, Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and other persons of color, as well as members of religious minorities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, LGBTQI+, and persons with disabilities. Persons who live in rural areas, you don't always think about it, but people in rural areas can be very disadvantaged, and persons otherwise adversely affected by persistent poverty or inequality. So the source of that is an infographic from the Health and Human Services. Next slide. So I wanted to go back and revisit those 6 principles of trauma-informed practices. And Lynn mentioned that we were going to really focus on the bottom 3, the collaboration and mutuality, which we've talked about in our exercise, the empowerment, voice, and choice, which is something we should be pulling into our practices regularly, and then the cultural, historical, and gender issues. And so we might see these struggles coming up with people who have been incarcerated, experienced domestic violence, prostitution, long-term institution, drug addiction, gangs, and many other circumstances or survival mechanisms. And culturally sensitive trauma-informed care is the capacity for us as care professionals to effectively provide trauma-informed assessment, intervention that we acknowledge and respect and integrate patients and family cultural values, beliefs, and practices. And one example is folks that take on different roles depending on who they are as cultural beings and what their experiences are and continue to be. For instance, in some cultures, the father is the one who makes all the decisions for health and otherwise. So this therapist is not expected to speak with the patient, but to always speak with the father, who then makes the decision about what can and cannot happen. So in that case, you might say that the father has all the power. And then historical trauma is really talking about intergenerational trauma, where trauma has hit a particular culture across generations, and that culture carries on. There's a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding from massive group trauma across the generations. And these kinds of traumas include slavery, genocide, colonialism, forced relocation, and the other historical and traumatic events that we've seen over the course of time. And these, of course, bring chronic emotional and physical pain, high mortality rates, depression, anxiety, substance use, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. So there's so many aspects to, when we think about the cultural, historical, and gender issues that we're dealing with, that we can't treat everybody just as one person. It's so important to be to have cultural humility, to really remain curious, to really ask people what they need from us at any particular point in time. So I'll revisit this in a moment, but I'd like to go on to the next slide for now and really talk a little bit about power dynamics. There's one model that I think is particularly interesting when we think about power dynamics, particularly when we think about different cultures and norms. So power dynamics are a common cause of conflict and drama. While there may be many ways in which power can be used or misused, people often take one of three distinct power roles. One is the role of the persecutor, one is the role of the rescuer, and one is the role of the victim. And as we think of the different cultures, and based on our earliest influences, many of us end up in power struggles throughout our lives, and they show up in school, at home, in friendships, and eventually in the work that we do. A quote that I really like is from Brene Brown that says, "True compassion is not between the wounded and the healed, it's between equals." So when we look at these power dynamics, it's a matter of how do we take these three distinct roles and find a way to equalize them so that we're treating each other equally. So our purpose is, even as practitioners, isn't there an element of power struggles and how we get into them with people? We see ourselves as the provider, which really fits into the rescuer role, and the person could be seen in the poor victim role. But if they don't do what we think they should in the time frame that we have set for them, and as we mentioned, in our exercise, a lot of this is driven by the billing structures and how it is that people need to be pushed through the process. So if they're not going through the process quickly enough, and they don't do it in the time frame that we have set for them, we may begin to see the person who's providing services as the persecutor. And the person providing services could even get resentful and blame the person for not taking advice. Next slide. So here again are the definitions. So we might see these power struggles come up in the people we serve who have been incarcerated, who have experienced domestic violence, who have experienced prostitution, who've been in long-term institutionalization, who've experienced drug addiction, or in gangs, and many other circumstances that are past or current survival mechanisms. And to sort of see how this plays out, this power dynamic role, I just wanted to share a little fairy tale so that you can see how these roles can change from one to another. You might be the persecutor one day, you might be the victim the next, you might be the rescuer. You know, you can be the same person, but depending on the circumstances, these roles can change. So we'll start out with one day, Little Red Riding Hood's mother asks her to go and visit her grandmother with a basket of food. In that case, she's the rescuer. On the way, Little Red Riding Hood meets a talking wolf who frightens her, and the wolf is the persecutor, with Little Red Riding Hood being the victim. The wolf asks where she's going, and afraid for her life, she tells him that she's going to visit her grandmother, and the wolf goes on ahead. When the wolf gets there, he knocks on the door, pretends he's Little Red Riding Hood bearing food for the grandmother. The grandmother tells the wolf to come in, and the wolf eats the grandmother. So the wolf is the persecutor, the grandmother's the victim. Then the wolf gets in bed and pretends to be the grandmother. He's just so rudely gobbled up. When Little Red Riding Hood arrives and knocks on the door, the wolf pretends to be the grandmother, whose voice sounds hoarse because she's got a sore throat. Little Red Riding Hood enters the house and, surprised by her grandmother's big arms, all the better for embracing you, my child, the wolf grandmother replies. Deep voice, all the better for greeting you, the wolf grandmother replies. All the better for hearing you, and her big eyes, all the better for seeing you, and then her big teeth, and all the better for eating you. And with that, the wolf tries to eat Little Red Riding Hood, who cries out, but then a huntsman, a rescuer, turns up, cuts open the wolf's stomach, frees the grandmother, and then the huntsman becomes the rescuer, the wolf becomes the victim, and the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood become survivors. So that's kind of how it can shift, the power dynamics can shift in these kinds of triangles. And that's just to say, what might it look like in psychiatric rehabilitation practice? Well, these roles are normally outside of our conscious awareness. Nobody ever says, I believe other people can't take care of themselves. That's the typical rescuer, which is a power role because you're saying that you don't believe people can take care of themselves. Nobody really ever says that, but it may be kind of an implicit bias that people have. In a given situation, one may behave that way without even realizing it, responding based on past experiences. So what tends to happen in the helping professions is the helper role takes on the role of the rescuer with the good intentions of helping others, but may leave others with the impression that they need to be rescued and that they can't do things for themselves. And the power structure of the organization, as we talked about before, billing structures and things, the boss takes on the role of the persecutor, and the staff has to do what the boss says, and then they come to the rescue of the people. People receiving services may see themselves as helpless if they've never had any power of their own or not been encouraged to take power in their own lives. But eventually they come to recognize that they are no longer a victim, and then they can take on the role of a person who's a survivor. That's not on the power dynamic, but that's really what happens when people finally reach the point of recognizing that they can take on a role of self-determination and autonomy. So anyway, now what I want to do is go on to the next slide, which is, what is one thing that you can do to shift power in different relationships to be more equal? So what's one thing you can do to shift power to be more equal when you see that there's an imbalance of power, when there's inequality, or you see that things are just not fair? Yeah. Be curious, listen, be aware of bias, yes. Practice humility, speak up, speak out. Have self-awareness, empathy, love it. Sit back, active listening, that's huge. Being patient, getting rid of your own ego, shared Questioning your own ethics, yeah. Validating people, giving the space to hear needs, communicating, giving choices, being mindful of bias, advocating, always be present, not being critical, not being the critic. Self-confidence. Stop talking. It's a good one. So these are great. These are great ways that we can, when we recognize there's an imbalance of power in the relationships that we have, and especially if we end up in one of those power triangles, which can happen so easily. And when you have awareness of it, you can actually see it happening. And then you can do things like listen, like validating people, like suspending disbelief, open ears. I love that. Asking questions, and really staying humble and staying honest with where you're at and asking people where they're at. I love that. Learn and assist with sharing to others. Yep. Understanding the person's trials and tribulations. Yeah. I think the idea of giving people choices and options, but before even giving choices and options, really hearing who they are and coming to know who they are is so important. So listening, advocating, being mindful of body language. I love that. That's great. And sharing the power, recognizing when you have the power, how is it that you can allow somebody else to have the power? I'm reminded from the last webinar when Lenora talked about her mother going to see a doctor, and her mother would not speak at the doctor's office, but was very upset about what was happening in the doctor's office. And when she came back home and talked to Lenora about it, she just did not feel heard. She didn't feel validated. She didn't feel like the doctor knew her, didn't feel like the doctor cared, and there's so much to unpack with that. When people feel they don't have the power in a situation or don't have the ability to speak up. When people aren't speaking up, that's probably the time that we most need to, to listen, to just really be curious and ask questions and really sit back and listen to what's going on for them. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next slide. So, and this did come directly from a discussion with Lenora. So shared power means letting go, relinquishing control. It's only when each person feels heard, respected, and supported that power can be shared. It's based on cultural humility, not assumptions. It requires unlearning. So the things we think we know, we need to stop and allow the other person to teach us. So it requires unlearning. And it requires asking rather than telling. What do you need to be comfortable right now? What is important to you right now? What do you need to feel respected? It really requires being open to feedback, and especially feedback to improve your practices. So shared decision-making can only be truly shared when each person feels heard, respected, and supported from their cultural context, whatever that is. Really being respected and heard from that context. On the part of the practitioner, it requires unlearning what we think we know, and instead asking each person what they want us to know. With each person asking, what do you need to be comfortable right now? It requires cultural humility to stop making assumptions and ask each person to help you understand how you can help. Again, it involves staying open to feedback and using that feedback to improve your practice. So shared power means relinquishing control in the spaces where you have the power to give access to power to other people, which I think is just wonderful. So the next slide. Many of us are very, very familiar with the idea of being person-centered. And this is just a little illustration of being person-centered versus being person-driven, because there's a real shift in the power dynamic when we look at it this way. When we're If we go to the next slide, when we're person-centered, it's the doctor's opinion, it's the family's opinion, it's the rehab practitioner's opinion, it's the social worker's opinion, it's the therapist's opinion, it's the funder's opinion, and it's the agency's opinion, all focused on what the person needs. And it may in fact include some of what the person wants, but it's all focused downward on the person. Whereas if we go to the next slide, the power shifts when we actually make it person driven. And it turns around so that people are not only in the center of the circle. And if you, yep, thank you. Keep clicking I think that the animation will come. So people are not only in the center, but they're in control of the entire process. This is where they have the power to choose and the power to refuse, the power to reclaim self-determination over their own lives, and the power to say, I don't know, and the power to choose who it is that they want to explore that with. So I think there's a really dynamic shift between person-centered versus person-driven. And I think as we look at power, sharing power, trying to equalize the power, trying to get rid of the hierarchy, looking at power driven and making sure that the person, as much as possible, can be in control of their own process. That's really what we need to be striving for.
And one thing I wanted to say in this, what it says is when people come up with answers like, I don't know, then the next step isn't to try to force an answer. It's to support the person to find ways to figure it out for themselves. Because so often we'll ask people, well, what's your goal? I don't know. Well, we need to come up with a goal. So let's get a goal instead of really exploring and giving the person the opportunity to answer those questions for themselves. We may sometimes be the facilitator of the process, but the process we want to be facilitating is a process of the person's own discovery about their own needs or wants. So if they can't define it now, giving them the opportunity through our skillful facilitation, right? That's where we come in. That's some of the expertise we can bring to the table, is we can be in that place to really support the person to find their answers to share with us, rather than putting our answers on when theirs don't come quick enough.
Thank you, Lynn. Yeah, well said. So the next slide. And here we're returning back to the principles of trauma-informed practice of safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, peer support. And here we've really focused on collaboration and mutuality. Sharing power is really all about creating that collaborative, mutual kind of relationship with people. And we also talked a little bit about empowerment and choice, and also about cultural, historical, and gender issues. So we see the role of power sharing, or power sharing and letting go of power in the tenets of trauma-informed practices. And yep, I think I just covered that. So we can go to the next slide. So in summary, psych rehab is collaborative with tools that help support the person's active participation. And as providers, we determine how these tools are used. But we also have a big role in engaging with people in cultural and trauma-informed ways to make sure that the tools are used well. Next slide. And what I'd like to do is sort of leave with a little bit of a poem that I've been aware of for a number of years. And it's it describes power really, really well. And that is, power is a source of energy or strength, or authority, as in the power vested in me. But the misuse of authority has turned power into something bad and sometimes sinister. Power over implies an imbalance of power, with the one on top being more, the one on the bottom being less powerful. Being on the bottom of the situation, we may call up power against some foe. Hence, power becomes an opposing force or opposing forces in tension with each other. It may also be a liberating force when power becomes the strength to overcome. And as we think about psych rehab and what we've talked about today, I really think this says it all. If we join forces with others, we combine our own power with others, and we use it for something good. And so with that, I think we have another keyword, and our keyword is brown. So our keyword is brown at this point. And I have a really useful resource for talking more about accessibility, cultural responsiveness, and trauma-informed practices, and that's on the next slide. So I've given you a link to this on the slide. When you get the slide, you'll be able to access this. It's called Tools for Transformation, Becoming Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed for Organizations. It's an organizational reflection toolkit. So as an organization, you can look at some of these issues, and especially the power dynamics that come with them, to help ensure that we're looking in equitable ways of working with people.
So we have a request to go back 2 slides.
Okay.
And now we get to also start looking at some questions. And I see that we already have a great question in the chat box to start with. So I'll put it out, and between Rita and I, hopefully we'll get you a good answer. So my concern is, as psych rehab practitioners, how do we get inpatient facilities that use the medical nursing model to use the rehab tools? So I see you're thinking, Rita, so I'll throw in my 2 cents first. I don't think it's our job to have nursing become rehab practitioners. I think it's most important that we spend our time really focusing on how we do our rehab work with folks. And sometimes that may even be explaining, you're in a more medical modeled kind of institution. But together we can work and see what you want in your life and see if we can help you move to a place that isn't so medically modeled. I think trying to change the system is great, and we're all always trying to do that. But there's a lot of individuals that will be left behind if we're waiting to change people that are trained in that really medical model approach. I think sometimes we can be the refreshing breath of air in that system that can really give people hope and feel valued and find ways themselves to have conversations with those other practitioners who may not feel to them as respectful and so forth. But it's really hard to change other people in different professions to be thinking as we are. That's my take on it, but what's yours, Rita?
Well, I think there is a push for more recovery-oriented practices throughout all of the systems of care. And I know for sure that OMH is looking at that very carefully. I don't know how far they're going to get into the hospital systems, but I do know that this is a big push for all systems. And as it's demonstrated effective, I think that's where we're going to start seeing these systems start to really look at, well, what's happening here that's making people actually get better when people have traditionally not gotten better for years and years and years.
Great. Other questions while Rita and other folks are moving backwards in the slides? I know that was requested. Other questions? You can put them.
That one is asking about the victim, persecutor, and rescuer. Yep. Couldn't write fast enough. Yeah. So the victim is someone who thinks that they cannot take control or care of themselves. They're powerless. The persecutor is someone who feels they have to coerce or use power over people in order to get things done. And then the rescuer is somebody who believes other people cannot take care of themselves. And that seems to be almost a harmless, when you look at it on the surface, kind of power dynamic, except that what it's really saying is, I don't believe you can take care of yourself, so I'm going to take care of you. And that then becomes a different kind of power dynamic that often people in the helping professions, and I know even in peer support too, we often fall into this rescuer role. And it's really, instead of trying to fix people, we've really got to learn how to allow people to take control of their own lives and become empowered for themselves.
And a lot of times this is about our own place in our own recovery and healing, because a lot of times that fix it, which is the other word for rescuer, right, is the fix it inclination comes from the fact that it's really hard for me as the practitioner to sit in the pain that is being out in the space right now. So instead of being okay with giving it space and some silence and maybe asking an open-ended question, I need that pain to go away. It's too hard for me. And so I'm going to give you a solution so that we'll both feel better right now. Right. So it comes from both a desire to make it better for the other person, but it's often motivated unbeknownst, like we're not really aware of it, but it's often motivated by our own feeling of discomfort in that moment. So if I fix it for you, it's going to fix it for me too, because frankly, it's kind of painful right now and it's hard to sit in the pain. And so those roles will fluctuate a lot, because it really depends on what part of us is being brought into the situation and how comfortable we are in that space. And if we become uncomfortable, we may go from the rescuer to the victim to the persecutor, because we're trying to get ourselves in a place that feels safer as well. And we all do it. None of this is to say one role is good and one is bad. We all tend to jump amongst the roles that we learned as kids and brought into adulthood. But being aware of it can really help, but you'll see, once you sort of have an awareness of it and you start looking around, you'll see it all around you, because it sort of exists out in everywhere. So being aware of it can help us not step in places that are less helpful in the moment.
Yeah, the persecutor gets a bad rap, but often when you think about like bullies, are often people who have been bullied themselves. So it's a part of this power dynamic is kind of a recycling of these different power roles that have happened in cultural situations, in family situations, in school situations. I mean, if you look at the educational institution, these power dynamics are playing out all the time there. So, yeah.
And it's also not to say there's anything wrong with being helpful. Pat Deegan, I think, puts it best when she says, help isn't help if it doesn't actually help, right? So we just have to make sure that our good thoughts and good deeds are actually helpful in the moment for the person that we're trying to support, so that we're not helping ourselves rather than the person, and that it is the most helpful. A great example is all the help that our systems gave people for all those years in the best of intentions. It took a long time for us to realize that they were really teaching people learned helplessness, right? It wasn't because any of it was done from malice or anything like that, but that it took us a long time to realize that that help was not really all that helpful after all. So it's really just double checking, is the help I think I'm bringing to the table really helpful for the person, or is part of me in the mix? Or is it just help that I got taught a long time ago was helpful, but we've learned better now, and now know that it's not as helpful as once thought.
I love David's quote here. I've heard help is the sunny side of control.
Oh, I love that. Yes. Yep. Other questions or thoughts or concerns or anything?
How we can share power with someone who's mandated to our services.
Yeah.
I think it really becomes just validating who they are, listening, trying to understand what it is that they want. And if they don't want our services, then, we may not have control over saying that they don't need them, but
And being honest, saying you're mandated, but we're not mandated to offer it. Is this something you would like? You're welcome to hang out and sort of get the ambiance. We are not going to force you to take this class that we're offering or this. We're glad you're here. We hope the environment even feels useful for you. But we're not a place that forces, because we don't think that'll be helpful to you anyway. But we're glad you're here. In what ways can we support you while you're here? You know, so you can make the time useful while getting across the message that we're not gonna endorse control. But if there is a way that the time together can be useful, let's do that, right? So it sort of meets all the boxes. They've come, they've done what they're supposed to do. So they're meeting their requirement to come, and we're meeting our values to not make them do something once they get there, because that's against our values. That's what I've done, what we've done sometimes in some of the peer-run organizations we've done where people have been mandated. So yeah, I'm glad you came. Now what you do here, you know, we want you to choose and be involved because you'd like to be, or just hang out, whatever suits you the best.
so I think we might have time for one more. Anthony has asked, what about sometimes when you feel someone does need some pushing of some sort? Maybe they're in danger of giving up.
Tony, I can only speak from my own experience. And what my experience is, people pushed in the best of intents and it didn't help. It usually got I'm on a webinar, so it got a blankety blank from me back to them. And it sometimes would keep me from doing it longer because I felt controlled. So somebody engaging me would have gotten me there a lot quicker than pushing me. And even if I gave up on my own and I would come back on my own. Forcing me or pushing me to do something wasn't going to give me hope. It was just going to give me more. I'd have more of a power struggle with you, a more disconnection from you, and it didn't help. That's just my experience from the other end of the other side of the desk. So that's all I can speak to on that experience for me. But
And I can speak a bit about, you know, there's one principle in motivational interviewing, the difference between asking and telling. When you ask somebody, then they have control over the situation. When you tell somebody, they're going to push back against that. Yeah.
yeah,
And I see Leela gave us a healthy triangle, which is great. Yep, the dynamic of inviting over pushing, that's exactly it. Asking rather than telling. Perfect.
Yep.
I think we're down on time, Daniela. Do we have anything left that we need to share?
I think we are down on time, and I'm going to take the last minute or so just to kind of wrap things up for us. We do have a podcast that is becoming available. It's already available today on our Spotify channel, and it will be uploaded to YouTube and the website this afternoon, along with the recording from today's offering and the PowerPoint. So you'll have access to the resources, as well as, Rita, you had shared a resource with us the other day that we already posted onto the website. Could you just remind us the name of that resource?
It is shared decision making, I think.
I think that's right. Yes, for the life of me, I could not remember. The office hour is next week on the 20th from 2 to 3. You can register here. This is the link to our website for the registration. I did want to just also address, I know there were a lot of emails at the last minute today. Folks had some trouble getting in. So I hope that you will see that the emails for these offerings are coming directly from Zoom, because we're setting them up through our meetings and not through a webinar. But I want you to think about what we heard today. Think about any questions you might have around how we can share power a little more equally, and how we can sort of integrate power sharing a little bit more into our service provision in whatever delivery system we provide services in, whether it's through PSR and PSR, or through core services or HCBS services or pro services. Think about how it works now and how we might be able to make it a little bit more equal. So think about that. You can send your questions in through the website, through the information link on the website. You can send them in to me at Daniela.L@NIAPPers, or you can just come and send them in live during the webinar and the office hour, and we'll see if we can't stump Rita and Lynn a little bit. Just kidding, of course. I also want to make people aware that we do have the evaluation link, and we're putting it in the chat box so that you can have instant gratification to the evaluation if you so choose today. If you do not choose to take that link today, it will be emailed to all of you tomorrow. And we hope that we will see you all next week for the office hour. I want to take a minute just to say thank you to all of you for coming today and being so active in the chat box. There's plenty of references and resources here, so check that out as well. And Rita and Lynn, thank you very much for everything you've given us today, and we'll see you next week. Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.